Blood on the Chief by Anthony Darder, Chapter 1. The morning air in Los Angeles had that crisp, pre-dawn bite, but the sun was already working on the smog as I stepped off the pavement and into the quiet, sweet-smelling sanctuary of the corner flower shop. I stood there for a good minute, feeling as out of place as a switchblade at a Sunday school picnic. The shop owner, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, didn't need to ask. She spotted the awkwardness written all over my face. "Anniversary?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I cleared my throat. 1 year. I looked at the rows of lilies, carnations, and things I didn't have a name for. It all felt like a foreign language. I pointed vaguely at a colorful arrangement. "Those look bright." "Those are for a funeral, sir," she said, deadpan. She walked over, plucked a dozen long-stemmed red roses from a display case, and bundled them in paper with a skill that made me feel clumsy just watching her. "Go with these. It's a classic for a reason. You start experimenting, you end up in the doghouse. Trust me." "It's a bit cliché, isn't it?" She smiled, pushing them into my hands. "Clichés are just things that work. Don't overthink it." When I walked into the diner, the bell above the door chimed, and the place erupted. Big Mike, occupying his usual booth, let out a piercing whistle, followed by a chorus of catcalls from the counter regulars. "I never took you for the romantical type, Morgan," Mike shouted over the crowd, wearing a big, stupid grin. "That's because you never had the balls to ask me on a date, Mike," I shot back, keeping my eyes fixed on the counter. Rose was there, wiping down the formica, her expression shifting from surprise to a genuine soft smile as I slid the paper-wrapped bundle toward her. "Happy anniversary, dear," I said, feeling a little less like a detective and a little more like a man who actually knew what he was doing. Rose took them, cradling them as if they were made of glass. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching just enough to let me know the gesture landed. She looked up, her eyes bright. "It may not be flowers, but I'll buy your breakfast." I leaned against the counter, relaxing as the familiar smell of coffee and griddle grease washed over me. "Oh, you're going to regret that," I teased. "I have expensive taste." "Bullshit," she laughed, leaning over the counter toward me. "Would you like the steak and eggs today?" I couldn't help but grin. "Since you're buying, I do." The morning sun hit the back of the diner just right, warming the red vinyl of the booth. I leaned back, nursing the coffee, feeling a rare, genuine sense of accomplishment. The books were balanced, the agency was stable, and the team was finally finding a rhythm. Johnny had finally started settling into his office, and it was clear Joe and Sarge were moving in a direction that actually worked for them. The quiet was thin, though, and it didn't last. The front door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the morning crowd. Paulie walled in, flashing a quick, practiced wave to Rose at the counter before heading straight for the back. He slid into the opposite side of the booth, dropping into the seat with a heavy, uncharacteristic slump. He just stared at the tabletop, his hands folded flat, his posture as still as a statue. I gave him a moment, but silence wasn't Paulie's natural state. It was starting to grate. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I finally asked. Paulie looked up, his expression strained. "It's Veronica. She says we never go anywhere or do anything anymore." I smirked, leaning forward. "That sounds like an easy fix. You could start by inviting her to breakfast once in a while." "Why?" Paulie shot back, a ghost of a grin fighting through the frustration. "So she can join you all in giving me a hard time?" "I'm insulted," I said, putting a hand over my heart. Paulie didn't miss a beat. "You're insulted?" "Yeah. Do you really think your best friends would do something like that?" "Every fucking day," Paulie answered without a second of hesitation. I let out a low chuckle, shaking my head. He had me there. "Yeah, you're right. I'll buy your breakfast to make up for it." The mood shift was immediate. Paulie's face brightened, the tension melting away as quickly as it had arrived. "Rose," I called out as she approached with the pot. "Paulie needs a steak as well." As she topped off his cup, Paulie looked between us, his expression turning sheepish. "Oh, By the way, happy anniversary, you two. See, I didn't forget. I raised an eyebrow. Do you remember your own anniversary? Polly didn't blink. Sure, it's sometime in May. May what, Polly? He paused, his brow furrowing as he did the math. 23rd? 25th, I countered. Polly looked skeptical. Are you sure? I was there, remember? I asked, tapping the table for emphasis. Check your wedding band. Polly pulled the gold band off his finger, squinting as he held it up to the light to read the inside. He let out a long, deflating breath. Damn, you're right. When you've been married as long as I have, 3 years, Polly. You've been married 3 years. I reminded him, shaking my head. You ran to the church as soon as we got home. Polly slid the ring back on, his face deadpan. A year with Veronica and her mother feels like a lifetime. The bell above the door chimed again, bright and sharp, and in walked Johnny and Joe. Good morning, fellas, Johnny said, sliding into the booth next to me. We figured we'd find you two here, Joe added, already signaling toward the counter. Rose, just give us what they're having. I pushed my plate aside, a smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. I don't know if you'll like it. I think the cook slaughtered this horse last week. I believe it's gone bad. Joe didn't even blink. I've eaten worse. Polly, seizing the opportunity to stir the pot, leaned in with a feigned look of shock. Are you calling Sarge a bad cook? Joe didn't give him the satisfaction of a real rise, just shot him a sharp, easy grin. Go to hell, Polly. It was the usual rhythm, the kind of comfortable, sharp-edged back and forth that made the team feel like brothers. Rose came by with the extra plates, setting them down with a knowing smile and for the two newcomers before heading back to the kitchen. After the plates were cleared, we paid and walked out the door. The morning air outside the diner was thick with the scent of exhaust and the restless energy of Los Angeles. Cars buzzed down the street, and a paperboy stood on the corner, shouting headlines to a crowd of tourists who were too busy staring up at the grand, ornate facades of the Broadway theaters to notice the world moving around them. We didn't bother with the sights. We kept our heads down and walked straight to the office. Good morning, Sarge, I said, hanging my hat on the rack as we stepped into the quiet of the room. Good morning, Jack, she replied from her desk. Joe crossed the room, leaning down to give her a kiss, while Polly made a beeline for the leather sofa, flopping down into his usual spot with a heavy sigh. I pulled a Camel from my pack, struck a match, and exhaled a long, steady cloud of smoke. Hey, pal, can I get one of those from you? Johnny asked, patting his pockets. Forgot to pick some up this morning. I walked over to my desk, pulled open the drawer, and tossed him a fresh pack from the carton. Thanks, he said. Anything going on today, Sarge? I asked, leaning back against the wood. Not yet, she said, tapping her pen against the desk. The phone hasn't rung all morning. Some agency this is, I joked, blowing another ring of smoke. There's got to be somebody out there that needs killed. I'll go check the mail, Sarge said, standing up. I chuckled, shaking my head. They're not going to mail us someone to shoot, Sarge. A few moments later, she returned, holding a small stack of envelopes. She handed them out, one for each of us. I tore mine open, pulling out the heavy cardstock and stared at it for a long moment, a surprised grin forming as I read the elegant script. Well, I'll be damned, I said, the amusement clear in my voice. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Mr. David Thorne and Miss Joan Sullivan. I looked up at the others, the surprise still hanging in the air. Kansas City, Missouri. Mine says I have to bring Veronica, Polly says. Chapter 2. The station was a chaotic sprawl of steam and shouting, the kind of place that made you want to keep your back to a wall even when you were just trying to catch a train. But we weren't working. For once, the hardware was stashed away in the suitcases, and the only thing on my agenda was a suit, a ceremony, and a drink with David Thorne. The team was already clustered near the boarding gate, a familiar, solid presence in the sea of travelers. Everyone was there, checking their watches and bracing against the crowd, except for Polly and Veronica. When I finally caught sight of them, I understood the delay. Polly was moving at a shuffle, wrestling with more leather and canvas than a man should be allowed to carry on his own. It looked like he was moving his entire household to the Midwest. He spotted me, and even through the strain of the load, his eyes narrowed as he caught the smirk I couldn't quite wipe off my face. "Don't even fucking start with me, Morgan," he rasped, dumping a trunk with a heavy thud at my feet. "Veronica insists that she needs all of these clothes for the trip." I glanced at the mountain of luggage, then back at him. Is she planning on moving to Missouri? Her? No, Polly grunted, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Me? I might leave her ass there. I leaned in, keeping my voice low so the others wouldn't catch the full extent of his domestic misery. "Oh, I see how it is. You want the mother-in-law to yourself, you dirty dog." Polly didn't blink. He just stared at me with the kind of hollow, weary look that years of marriage can carve into a man's face. "If I was a dog and that was the only option, I would chew off my own balls," Polly shot back. With 30 minutes left before boarding, we retreated to the station's lounge to kill the time. I spent the interval scanning the bookstore, picking through paperbacks, while the rest of the crew found corners of the bar to settle into. When the call finally came, we navigated the platform toward the chief. We'd splurged on roomettes. It was a luxury for us, but after the last few months, a little comfort was well earned. And more importantly, it meant a bit of privacy for me and Rose. Joe and Sarge took a room, Polly and Veronica claimed another, and Johnny took one for himself, preferring the solitude. As the massive red and silver Santa Fe engine groaned, the train lurched forward, slowly gaining momentum until the sprawling lights of Los Angeles finally blinked out behind us. The steady, rhythmic click-clack of the wheels on the rails began to sing a lullaby, lulling the world into a state of motion. It wasn't long, however, before the thin walls of our roomette betrayed our neighbors. Muffled noises drifted through from Polly's room. "Are they fighting already?" Rose asked, tilting her head toward the partition. I leaned in, listening closer. It wasn't shouting or slamming doors. The rhythm was altogether different. "No, that's not a fight, dear." Then came a distinctly muffled squeal from next door. Rose's eyes widened, and she caught my gaze, a slow, mischievous grin spreading across her face. "Why should they be the only ones enjoying the night?" she asked. I played it cool, keeping my expression flat. "No, I could never." That was a lie. What kind of a fool do you take me for? Of course I said yes. It wasn't a competition, but by the time the morning light started filtering through the shade, I was damn sure who'd come out on top. When we gathered in the dining car for breakfast the next morning, the atmosphere was different. Polly looked like a new man. The tension from the luggage hauling incident was gone, replaced by a permanent, shit-eating grin. He leaned in towards me, lowering his voice. "I don't know what it is about trains, Jack. It did something to her." I smirked, leaning back as the waiter poured my coffee. Something definitely got inside of her last night, but I'm not sure it was the train. Polly let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "You and Rose didn't do so bad yourselves." "It was her idea," I replied, feigning innocence. "I'm sure it was," Polly shot back, shaking his head. "And you were completely innocent, I'm sure." "Of course, Polly." "Bullshit, Morgan," he laughed, digging into his eggs. "You are a lot of things. Innocent is not one of them." I sipped my coffee, letting the steam curl up past my eyes as I scanned the rest of the car. My gaze landed on the far end, and the taste of the breakfast suddenly soured. Sitting there, tucked into a corner booth, was Frank Adams. You couldn't miss him. Fat, jovial, sporting a full beard and a bowler hat that made him look like a misplaced British gentleman. Frank was a bounty hunter out of L.A. that I'd crossed paths with on a job or two. Solid man. But it was who he was sitting with that kept my attention locked. Next to him sat a thin, rat-faced piece of work. He had a slick, oily smile and a single gold tooth that caught the morning light. It took me a second to place the face, but then it clicked. I had spent a long, boring afternoon a couple of days back flipping through wanted sheets in the office. That was Silas Carver, a real vile bastard. The poster had been clear, a triple homicide back in Missouri. The story went that he'd charmed his way into a widow's life, waited until she and her 2 kids were fast asleep, then slit their throats and dumped them down a well. He'd cleaned out her accounts before the bodies were even cold and vanished. Rumor had been swirling that he'd headed west to hide out in California. Turns out the rumors were dead on. The reward was 50 grand, dead or alive. 50,000 reasons for a man like Carver to be looking for a way to break free. I felt a slight shift in the air next to me. Johnny Hill had leaned in, his eyes narrowed as he watched the pair. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which was saying something for a man who spent his life in the shadows. "What's wrong, Johnny?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Hill didn't look at me. His stare was fixed on Carver's hands. "I've seen that guy around. Never in good places. I hope that guy has a short leash on him and can sleep with one eye open." "That's Frank Adams," I said quietly. "He's a good guy." Hill finally turned to me, his expression flat and humorless. "Good guy or not, I hope he can shoot." We finished up in the dining car and made our retreat to the observation car, hoping for a bit of peace and a view of the landscape. It was a good plan until Veronica opened her mouth. She had been relatively subdued over breakfast, but the moment we settled in to watch the world go by, she kicked into high gear. It was becoming painfully obvious why Paulie preferred the office to his own living room. Sarge nudged me in the ribs, her voice a low murmur. "I don't think she has stopped long enough to take a breath." I couldn't help but let out a quiet chuckle. Paulie, a veteran of this particular psychological warfare, simply pulled his hat down low over his eyes and hunkered down, faking a nap to save his sanity. I looked over at Joe and Rose, a grin tugging at the corner of my mouth. "What are you scheming, Jack?" Rose asked, her eyes narrowing with that look that meant she knew exactly what I was doing. "Nothing at all," I said, putting on my best, most innocent face. I leaned forward, pitching my voice just loud enough to cut through the hum of the train and carry to everyone in the car. "Hey, Paulie," I called out. "Pay attention to your wife." Paulie lifted the brim of his hat, just enough to shoot me a glare that would have turned a weaker man to ice. His lips moved, silent but unmistakable. "Fuck you." I didn't blink. "Sorry, pal, you're not my type." I turned back to the rest of the group, and they were all doing their best to swallow their laughter, faces turning red as they stifled the noise. Veronica, however, never missed a beat, and she certainly didn't slow down for the interruption. She just kept right on rolling. "Look, Paulie, I think that's a jackrabbit. Where do you suppose we are? When are we supposed to get there? I hope I brought enough clothes. I think Mother will be all right for a few days alone. I wonder what kind of food they have in Kansas City." The train rolled on, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks providing the only background music to her relentless monologue. Paulie just sank deeper into his seat, resigned to his fate, while I sat back with my drink, enjoying the show. I tucked my book into my lap as Frank Adams approached, his bowler hat tipped slightly, that familiar, jovial mask failing to hide the weariness in his eyes. "Jack, I thought that was you," he said. "How's it going in Adams?" I asked. "Oh, you know how it is," he replied with a dry chuckle, taking a guy back to Missouri because their gas chamber is lonely. "Silas Carver?" I asked. "Yes. I caught the bastard in an opium den. 50,000, dead or alive." I looked past him. Carver was cuffed to a chair, but it hadn't dampened his spirits. He was currently leaning toward a young woman seated nearby, offering her a rehearsed, charming anecdote about the passing scenery. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second, his gold tooth shining with a calculated, oily grin that didn't reach his cold eyes. He was putting on a performance, testing the limits of the room, looking for the softest point in the perimeter. "I see you're trying the alive method," I said. "When I bring in a man, they see their day in court," Frank said, his expression hardening. "Who am I to deprive the state? If what the sheets say is true, he deserves worse than the gas chamber." "It's true, every word," Frank admitted, his voice dropping. "Those poor little kids, sleeping in their beds, It's too horrible to think about. He shook his head, clearing the thought. Well, what brings you this way, Morgan? I smiled, leaning back against the cool metal of the window frame. An old army buddy of ours is getting married in Kansas City. That's why we're here. Oh. Frank looked almost disappointed. So, you're not on the job? No, I replied. We're taking a vacation. Frank hesitated and glancing over his shoulder at the man in the chair before leaning in closer. Then I hate to ask, Jack, but I would appreciate it if you'd watch my back on the trip. I don't trust this son of a bitch to not try to get brave. He knows what awaits him in Missouri, and we both know what desperation can do to a man. I looked at Carver, at the way he was watching us, his eyes too bright, his smile too wide. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a man holding on to the last shreds of his own timeline. And I knew exactly the kind of damage a man like that could do when the walls started closing in. I'll keep an eye on you, Frank, I said. Chapter 3. The novelty of the chief was wearing thin, replaced by a lingering sense of static in the air. I sat in the observation car with Joe, nursing a lukewarm glass of whiskey while watching the landscape turn into a blur of brown and gold. Frank Adams was sitting a few rows up, still playing the role of the jovial gentleman. But I saw the fatigue when he didn't think anyone was looking. He had taken off his bowler hat, revealing a damp, receding hairline. And he was staring intently at a worn, leather-bound notebook. I nudged Joe. He's been staring at that book for an hour. Maybe he's writing a memoir, Joe muttered. I stood up and made my way over. As I approached, Frank tucked the book into his jacket pocket. He looked up, and the joviality didn't quite reach his eyes. They looked like two burned-out coals. Writing a bestseller, Frank? I asked, pulling up a chair. He let out a dry, wheezing laugh. Hardly, Jack, just a ledger. Calculating the cost of a garden, a fence, and a porch that doesn't sag. He tapped his chest pocket. This is the retirement fund. 50 grand pays for a lot of quiet, in case you didn't know. You finally hanging up the iron? Frank nodded, and for a second, the hard-bitten bounty hunter vanished, replaced by a man who looked tired of the dust, the blood, and the bad hotels. 20 years of chasing ghosts. I'm done, Jack. I bought a place just outside of Santa Fe. Nothing fancy, just a view of the mountains and a bed that doesn't have springs poking through the mattress. Carver is the last one. I get him to the judge, I get the check, and I become a farmer. It was the most honest thing I'd heard in a long time. It made the weight of his task, and my promise to watch his back, feel a hell of a lot heavier. I'll see you get there, Frank, I said, my voice low. I appreciate that. He gestured toward the far end of the car. Carver was sitting with his back to us, but his reflection in the window was watching every move we made. Carver wasn't just sitting. He was vibrating with a kind of sick energy, humming a tuneless melody that seemed to grate on the nerves of everyone nearby. Look at him. He's not waiting for a trial. He's waiting for the train to slow down. He's not going anywhere, I said, though I didn't feel as confident as I sounded. I hope not, Frank sighed, putting his hat back on. He's been trying to get inside the heads of the staff all morning. He's got that way about him, making people feel like they're the only ones who understand his misfortune. He's already got the porter thinking he's a misunderstood veteran. I looked at Carver. He was currently smiling at a young mother, his gold tooth flashing. It wasn't the smile of a desperate man. It was the smile of a spider weaving a web. I'll keep a closer eye on him, I said. Do that, Jack. I'm going to take a walk. My legs are cramping. Frank stood up, his joints popping, and adjusted his coat. He looked like a man who was already halfway to his porch in Santa Fe. The train groaned into a curve, the metal shrieking against metal as we began a long, sweeping climb through the desert flats. I kept my gaze fixed on Silas Carver. He sat in his chair like a man who wasn't chained at all. He moved with a restless, calculated lethargy, a spider waiting for the vibration of a fly hitting the web. He didn't just sit. He shifted, arched, and scanned, his eyes darting toward every passenger who walked by, measuring their potential as either an obstacle or a tool. Johnny Hill walked past, heading toward the restroom. He didn't look at Carver, keeping his posture loose and his hands in his pockets. But when he came back, his timing was interrupted. As he drew level with the booth, Carver's hand shot out. He gripped Johnny's forearm with a surprising sinewy strength. He leaned in, whispering something behind a shielding hand. I couldn't catch a syllable, but I saw the slight tension in Johnny's neck, the way he stiffened before pulling his arm free. Johnny didn't break stride, but he didn't head back to his own compartment. He walked straight to our table and slid into the seat across from me and Joe. His face was a mask, but his eyes were hard. That guy might be a problem, Johnny murmured, keeping his voice below the ambient roar of the tracks. He recognized me from a job a few years back. Said once he gets rid of the bounty hunter, he's taking over the train. He wants me to help him do it. Joe just let out a dry, amused huff. No, that's actually a good thing, Johnny, Joe said, leaning in. Let him think you're an ally. Play the part. See how deep his plan goes. I looked over at the table where the women were sitting. Rose and Sarge were staring out the window, effectively tuning out the world. A few seats away, Paulie sat with his eyes squeezed shut, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a bridge, ready to jump just to end the noise. Veronica was, as ever, in full throttle. Her voice was a steady, relentless stream, a river of chatter that didn't seem to require the pause of a single breath. I don't know how she does it, I muttered, shaking my head. It's been hours. Joe glanced at her, then back at his drink, a ghost of a smile on his face. Her jaw muscles are probably the strongest muscles on her body. I looked back at Carver. He had released his grip on the chair and was now buffing his gold tooth with a fingernail, humming to himself. He knew we were watching him, and he didn't care. He was playing with his food, and we were all sitting at the table. I'm not sure what Carver said, but the slap echoed across the car, sharp and stinging, cutting right through the rhythm of the train. The girl, no older than 20, was on her feet instantly, her face flushed with a mix of fury and genuine fright. She didn't stay to hear his response. She gathered her purse and bolted toward the next car, leaving a trail of startled stares in her wake. For a heartbeat, the mask fell. Carver's head snapped with the force of the blow, and when he turned back toward the aisle, the charm had evaporated. His eyes were flat, dead things, burning with a cold, jagged rage that suggested he was already calculating how he'd have liked to handle the situation if the cuffs weren't there. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the grin returned, wide, yellowed, and mocking. He started to laugh, a wheezing, theatrical sound that invited the rest of the car to laugh along with the misunderstood prisoner. Keep an eye on that asshole, I muttered to Joe, my voice dropping an octave. I'm going to go talk to Adams. Joe didn't look up from his drink, but his posture shifted, his hand drifting casually toward the hidden weight under his jacket. He's not going to make it easy for us, Jack. He doesn't want it to make it easy, I replied. I stood up, keeping my movements deliberate. I navigated the swaying aisle, stepping around a spilled drink and a toddler in the walkway, until I reached the back of the train. I stepped through the heavy metal door. The sudden blast of wind and the rhythmic grinding roar of the wheels beneath us hitting me at once. The rear observation deck was a narrow, exposed strip of steel, the sky above already bruising into the deep purple of twilight. Frank Adams was standing at the railing, his bowler hat pulled tight against the breeze, staring down at the twin ribbons of track as they shrieked and blurred away into the distance. He looked older out here in the fading light, the joviality completely stripped away, leaving only the grim reality of a man nearing the end of a long, ugly road. I didn't say anything at first. I just reached into my coat, pulled out my pack, and held it out. Frank didn't turn, but he reached back, his fingers unerringly finding a cigarette. I flicked my lighter, shielding the flame until he leaned in. He took a long, deep drag, the glowing tip illuminating the deep, tired lines around his eyes. "I'm tired, Jack," he said, his voice barely audible over the train's thunder. "I've spent 20 years tracking down the scum of the earth. That's why I'm putting myself out to pasture." "Yeah, I get that," I said, leaning against the railing next to him. "Just don't let your guard down. Silas Carver's a greasy bastard. Don't let him slip from your grasp." Frank took another drag, letting the smoke trail off into the night air. He finally turned to look at me, and I saw a flash of the man he must have been a decade ago, sharp, cold, and entirely focused. "He won't," Frank said, his voice dropping into a register that wasn't meant for casual conversation. "I'm tired, but I'm still just as deadly as I ever was." He turned back to watch the tracks, his expression hardening. "I want Carver to think I'm old and slipping," he continued, his hand resting casually near the iron of his holster. "When he tries something, I will beat him within an inch of his life. I said I'm bringing him in alive. I didn't say he would be pretty when he got there." I nodded once, respecting the play. It was a dangerous game to walk, giving a man like Carver the illusion of an opening. But it was the kind of move that kept a bounty hunter alive for 20 years. "Just make sure you don't wait a second too long to make your move, Frank," I said. "I know the rhythm, Jack," he replied, tapping the ash into the wind. "I've been dancing to it my whole life. This is just the last verse." I left him there on the deck, a lonely figure framed against the rushing dark. He had a plan, and he had his pride. I just hoped that Carver, for all his monstrous instincts, wasn't smart enough to read the man better than I could. I headed back inside, this air in the observation car feeling suddenly thin. I found Joe, Sarge, and Rose right where I left them. The rhythmic click-clack of the tracks, which had sounded like a lullaby the night before, now sounded like a countdown. "Everything all right?" Rose asked, picking up on the shift in my mood instantly. "Adams has it under control," I said, though the words tasted like copper. Or at least he thinks he does. I took my seat and glanced across the car. Carver had shifted his position. He was still cuffed, but he'd managed to manipulate his chair to face the aisle. He was watching the door I'd just come through. He was watching me. And when he saw me looking back, that gold tooth caught the overhead light like a signal. Chapter 4. The transition from the tension of the observation car to the narrow confines of our roomettes felt like stepping into a decompression chamber. The team retreated to their bunks, but the air in the corridor was thick with unspoken nerves. I stripped off my coat, the weight of the shoulder holster a reminder of why we were all on edge. I wanted this vacation. I wanted the suit, the ceremony, and the slow, easy drinks with David Thorne. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gold-toothed grin reflected in the observation window. I wasn't about to risk my team, especially not Rose, for some monster in a set of cuffs. Still, the impossibility of relaxing, of letting my guard drop, was a slow-burning irritation in the back of my throat. I lay in the dark, my hands laced behind my head, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic clack-clack of the steel rails. It was supposed to be a lullaby, but tonight it sounded like the ticking of a clock. Then, through the thin partition that separated us from the next roomette, the silence was broken. The sound started low, a rhythmic creaking of the metal frame, followed by a muffled, frantic scuffling. Then, a sharp gasp that broke into a rhythmic cadence. Rose shifted in the bunk, her eyes snapping open in the gloom. She tilted her head toward the partition, a small, weary smile ghosting across her face. "Again?" she whispered. I let out a long, slow breath, the tension in my shoulders easing just a fraction. I guess it's one way to get her to shut up. We shared a look in the dim light filtering in from the corridor. There was no competitive spark tonight, no urge to match them or prove who could make the most noise. We were just two people, suddenly grateful for a moment of quiet, even if it was punctuated by the domestic theater happening next door. The noises continued, the squeal of the springs harmonizing with the roar of the train, but it felt distant now, almost comforting in its banality. "Good night, dear," I said softly, reaching out to tuck the blanket around her. "Good night, Jack," she murmured, closing her eyes. I reached up and clicked off the small reading lamp. The room went pitch black, save for the occasional flash of trackside lights strobing through the blinds. I let the fatigue win, pulling me down into a deep, heavy sleep, trusting that for the next few hours, the only monster on this train was the one we were already keeping an eye on. The next morning, we trickled into the dining car, one by one, the bright, unforgiving morning light doing little to settle the restlessness that still hummed in the back of my mind. When Polly finally sauntered in, looking entirely too refreshed for a man who'd been under siege by his own wife for the last several hours, I gave him a look of practiced disgust. "You are going to owe the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe a new bed," I said, sliding his coffee over to him. He didn't even try to hide the smirk. He leaned back, crossing his arms with a look of supreme satisfaction. "If that's the case, we'll be sure to break it good." "You know, Polly," I said, leaning in, "as much as you complain about her, I can see the intimacy is still there. She might be a handful, but she's clearly keeping you on your toes." "It's the train, I'm telling you, pal," Polly insisted, though his eyes betrayed that he was enjoying the change in tempo. Something about the motion. It does something to her. Joe chimed in from across the table, buttering a slice of toast with meticulous care. "There might be something to that. Betty was all over me last night. I didn't think she had that much energy in her." I laughed, catching Joe's eye. "I'm sure Sarge even has a military cadence for that." The timing couldn't have been worse. Sarge happened to be walking by at that exact moment, heading for the galley. She didn't miss a beat. "Damn straight," she said, her voice dry and perfectly timed. Joe's face went from its usual calm to a bright burning red in about a second. The table erupted. "Well, I guess that just leaves you, Johnny," I said, gesturing to the chair where Hill had just sat down. "You get any motion-induced inspiration last night?" Johnny Hill picked up his fork, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Not exactly. I didn't sleep in my bunk last night. I received an invitation from a nice young lady to keep her company." I raised an eyebrow, leaning back. "Oh yeah? What was her name?" Johnny shrugged, completely unbothered. "Hell if I know." I shook my head, a grin spreading across my face. "I guess some things never change. You did almost get locked up for going AWOL with a Belgian whore. You couldn't remember her name then, either. When you experience something that beautiful, there is no need in exchanging names," Johnny said, his tone entirely serious, which only made it funnier. The table dissolved into laughter again, the kind of raucous, slightly unhinged noise that only a group of people who had been through too much together could produce. Rose, who had been sitting quietly watching the back and forth, finally shook her head, though a chuckle slipped through. "You guys are absolutely horrible." The laughter at our table didn't die out instantly. It faded into a low murmur as the dining car's atmosphere shifted. The heavy glass door at the end of the carriage slid open with a protest of sliding metal. Silas Carver walked in, his gait loose and predatory. He didn't look at the floor or the menu. His eyes were locked directly on our table, tracking us with a steady, insolent focus. Following a step behind was Frank Adams, who looked like he'd aged since the previous evening. His skin was sallow, his eyes rimmed with red, and he moved with a bone-deep exhaustion that made his hand tremble slightly as he reached for the chain. Carver moved to a table near the center of the car. Frank didn't hesitate. He unlocked the cuff from his own wrist and secured it to the heavy metal frame of the chair. Carver leaned back, his gold tooth catching the light, looking less like a prisoner and more like a man who'd just claimed a throne. They ordered, but the food didn't seem to be the point. Frank sat with his coffee, his eyes darting to the door and then back to his prisoner, his posture stiff, guarding the ledger in his pocket. Carver, meanwhile, wasn't eating. He was working. I watched him over the rim of my cup. He was systematically scanning every face in the room, not with a glance, but with a study. He tracked the way the waiter moved, The location of the emergency lever, the latch on the window, and the distance between the dining car and the lounge. He was memorizing the terrain. He knew the layout of the chief better than the conductor did by now. "He's not hungry," Johnny murmured, his voice so quiet I barely caught it. "He's hunting," I replied. I looked at Frank. He was staring at the table, seemingly oblivious to the way Carver was dissecting the room. It was the old and slipping act, performed with the kind of commitment that made my stomach churn. If Carver fell for it, well, Frank would have his opening. But if Carver was just waiting for Frank to get tired enough to make one genuine mistake, the play was going to turn lethal. Carver's gaze swung back to our table. He caught me watching him and didn't look away. Instead, he slowly lifted his coffee cup in a mock toast, his smile widening to reveal that flash of gold. He was letting us know he saw us, and he was letting us know he had no intention of reaching Kansas City in those cuffs. I set my cup down, the porcelain clinking against the saucer. "Finish up," I said to the table, my voice flat. "I think the air in here just got a little too thin." It wasn't a slow build. It was an explosion. Carver went from sitting perfectly still to a frenzied, guttural roar. He launched his plate of eggs across the aisle, the porcelain shattering against the porter's chest. And with a sweep of his shackled arms, he swiped his coffee cup off the table. It disintegrated against the floor, a dark splash of liquid spraying across the pristine white tablecloth. "I can't take this anymore!" Carver shrieked, his voice cracking with a theatrical, manic intensity. "I'm not a dog. Take these off." Johnny and I were already moving before the cup hit the ground. Frank was struggling to keep him contained, his movements appearing sluggish and desperate. The perfect performance of a man losing his edge. "I need to get this lunatic back to the room," Frank barked, his face pale and sweating. "I can't handle him in public." We reached the booth in 3 strides. Johnny grabbed Carver's left arm, pinning him against the back of the seat. For a split second, the rage on Carver's face vanished, replaced by an unnerving, calculating calm. As Johnny wrestled him into a standing position, Carver leaned in, his lips brushing against the shell of Hill's ear. The walk back to the sleeper cars was a grueling public affair. Carver fought with a sinewy, frantic energy, thrashing against our grip and screaming obscenities that silenced the entire train. He was dead weight 1 second and a spring-loaded trap the next, forcing us to drag him through the narrow corridors as passengers shrank away in terror. We finally shoved him into his roomette. He lunged at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. But Frank was ready. With a grunt of exertion, Frank delivered a clean, heavy right hook that snapped Carver's head back. Silas went limp, crashing onto the bottom bunk like a sack of wet sand. Frank scrambled to secure the cuffs to the metal frame of the bed, his chest heaving. He then pulled out a needle and gave Silas something to calm him down. "Thanks, boys," Frank wheezed, wiping a smear of blood from his knuckles. He leaned against the doorframe, looking like he might collapse. "I've got it from here. The sedative in his system should keep him quiet for a while. You know where to find us if you need us?" I said, eyeing the unconscious man. Carver looked peaceful, but his hands were still bunched into tight, angry fists. "I know," Frank said, closing the door behind us. Johnny and I walked back through the quiet corridors of the train, the adrenaline slowly receding into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The train was back to its rhythmic, swaying motion, but the silence felt heavier than before. I didn't wait until we were back at our table. I kept my voice low, my eyes on the doors ahead of us. "What did Silas whisper to you?" Johnny didn't turn his head. He said, "Soon, are you in or out?" I felt the air in the corridor turn frigid. And nothing," Hill said, his expression grim. "How soon? I don't know. But judging by that performance back there, I don't think we have much time." He wasn't just throwing a tantrum, Jack. He was clearing the board. I looked toward the dining car, then back at the door where Frank was standing guard. Carver was playing his hand, and we were running out of ways to fold. Chapter 5. The air in the observation car was thick enough to chew on. At the far end, a woman was holding court, surrounded by a cloud of floral perfume, so aggressive it felt like an olfactory assault. It was the kind of scent that lingered on your clothes for days, the kind they advertised as allure, but smelled more like a French whorehouse. We retreated to a corner table, pulling out a deck of cards and sparking up cigarettes, hoping the blue haze of the camels would act as a buffer against the floral onslaught. We'd played a few listless hands when Frank Adams drifted over, looking like he'd finally managed to unspool a few knots in his nerves. He pulled up a chair, his movements weary but controlled. "Deal me in, boys," he said, signaling the porter for a fresh coffee. "He's dead to the world. That sedative should keep him under for a long stretch." Joe shuffled the deck, his eyes lingering on Frank for a second longer than necessary. "What's the plan for when he wakes up?" He looked ready to tear the walls down. Frank shrugged, the gesture stiff. "Hope he's calmed down. Sometimes they wake up feeling like they've been kicked by a mule, and that takes the fight right out of them." Johnny Hill didn't look up from his hand. "I'm afraid that fit was a bit of acting for Frank. Don't let the lack of movement fool you. I'd be careful with that one. He's looking for a way out." I didn't want to think about Carver. I wanted the cards. I tossed 2 pennies into the center, trying to keep the mood from sliding into the gutter. "3 of a kind. Read 'em and weep, boys." I reached for the pot, feeling a brief, rare moment of triumph, only for a sharp, confident sound to cut through the air. "That's pretty good, Jack," Sarge said, her voice dripping with that cool, military rhythm. She laid her hand down with a satisfied thwack. "But it doesn't beat 4 of a kind." She raked the pile of pennies toward her, movements fluid and practiced. I leaned back, narrowing my eyes at her. "Somebody check her sleeves," I joked, though my gaze drifted toward Rose. "I know she's got cards up there somewhere." I knew Sarge didn't have anything up her sleeves. She was too good to be that obvious. I saw the telltale movement under the table. Rose was tucking a stray card away, her lips curled into a faint, mischievous smile. She was cheating, and she was having the time of her life doing it. For a second, the tension in the room snapped. We were just a group of friends on a train, killing time, laughing at a petty heist at the poker table. It was a perfect, fragile little bubble. I looked over at Frank. He was watching us, a small, sad smile on his face. "Your deal, Joe," I said, forcing the smile to stay on my face. "Let's see if I can win back my retirement fund." The cards hit the felt with a crisp snap, but Rose's touch was a second too slow this time. As she tried to palm a discarded jack, her wrist caught the edge of her coffee cup, and the card fluttered face up onto the table like a dying bird. "Oh no," I said, leaning back with a theatrical sigh. "Caught red-handed. You've been working for the enemy, Rose." She didn't even try to pull it back. Instead, she just pushed the card toward the center, smiled, and batted her eyelashes at me with such practiced innocence. It almost worked. "Us girls have to stick together, Jack. You know that." "Stick together all you want," I retorted, giving her my best smart-ass smirk, while I reached over and tapped her purse, sitting on the seat. "But don't think I didn't notice. I already dipped into your change jar to cover the losses you've been racking up." Across the table, Frank's face had transformed. The weary lines were still there, but for the first time since we left L.A., he had a genuine, boyish grin plastered across his mug. He was holding his hand close to his vest, vibrating with the kind of excitement that usually meant a man was about to lose his shirt or land the score of a lifetime. "While you all bicker over pennies," Frank said, his voice actually steady, "I happen to have a full house." He laid the cards down, 3 kings and a pair of 8s. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't even acting like a grizzled bounty hunter. He was just a guy winning a hand at a card table. I flipped my own cards over. a pathetic pair of fives, and let out a laugh. Well, damn. You really are holding the winning hand, Frank. The table groaned and folded, and Frank started scooping up the pennies with a greedy, happy sound. I glanced over at the door leading to the sleeper cars. Behind that steel, Carver was still under, still sedated, still tied to the bed. Enjoy the win, Frank, I said, trying to push the unease back down into the dark. But don't get cocky. The house always wins eventually. Not today, Jack, Frank said, stacking his winnings into a neat little pile. Not today. He seemed so sure of it. I just hoped he was right. Frank stood up, the small pile of pennies clutched in his palm like a treasure. He looked lighter, the weight of the last 24 hours momentarily lifted by the simple joy of a winning hand. Now that I've won your life savings, I should go check on the prisoner, he said, tucking the loot into his pocket. Joe leaned back, a grin tugging at his mouth. You afraid you might lose it on the way back to the room? Frank let out a raspy, satisfied chuckle. Damn straight. This is going into my retirement fund. This will buy me a handful of nails, at least. Take it easy, Frank, I said, my smile fading as I watched him walk away. I turned back to the table, forcing the mood back to the game. Rose, it's your turn to deal, and I'll be watching you. No funny business. If Sarge ends up with a royal flush, you're going to pay for it tonight. Rose leaned across the table, her eyes dancing. Darling, are you threatening me with a good time? Damn straight, I said. I guess Sarge is winning this round, she replied, a secret knowing smile on her lips. Paulie groaned, dropping his head into his hands with a fake look of disgust. Knock it off, you two. Give it a rest. Like you have room to talk, Paulie, I fired back. Where is Veronica, by the way? She's laying down, Paulie muttered. She wants to be rested for tonight. I felt a smirk tugging at my face. Jesus Christ. You mean we have to listen to you huff and puff all night? Paulie didn't even look up. Keep your ear away from the wall if you don't want to hear. It can't be avoided. These walls are thin, I said, leaning in. Hey, Paulie. What? He snapped. I opened my mouth to deliver the jab, but the words died in my throat. From down the corridor, a sound ripped through the air. The heavy, sickening thud of a body against a metal door, followed by a frantic, wet struggle. We didn't wait. We moved as one, slamming our chairs back and sprinting into the corridor. The air grew cold as we reached the roomette. The door was hanging half open, swinging with the motion of the train. Inside, the world had turned into a nightmare. Carver was gone. The cuffs hung open and empty from the bunk's frame, swaying like a pendulum. Frank Adams was slumped against the wall, and it took me a second to realize that the red, pulpy mass on the floor was actually his face. He'd been beaten so savagely, he was unrecognizable. He was still breathing, but it was a jagged, rattling sound that turned my blood to ice. What the hell happened, Frank? I shouted, dropping to my knees. Frank's eyes fluttered, blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. He tried to speak, and the spray of crimson painted his chin. Bathroom, he wheezed. Bathroom? I pressed, my hand trembling as I tried to stop the flow of blood from his chest. Carver said he needed to go take a crap, Frank gasped, each word a physical agony. When I uncuffed him from the bed, he attacked. His chest shuddered, and I heard the unmistakable whistle of air escaping through a puncture in his lung. He'd been butchered. I looked up at the team, my voice coming out as a command that sounded more like a growl. Search the cars. Find that son of a bitch. Joe, Johnny, and Paulie didn't hesitate. They vanished into the corridors. Men on a brutal hunt. I turned back to Frank, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to offer him something, anything. Hold on, pal. I'll call for help. I reached for the emergency cord, but Frank's hand, heavy and cold, clamped onto my wrist. He looked at me, and for a split second, the confusion cleared. He wasn't thinking about the farmhouse in Santa Fe or the porch that didn't sag anymore. He was just a soldier who had reached the end of his watch. His grip loosened. The rattling in his chest stopped. Frank Adams went still, a pool of dark blood spreading slowly across the floor of the roomette, staining the carpet a deep, final shade of crimson. The train kept moving. The clack-clack of the tracks now sounding like a gavel. The vacation was officially over. Chapter 6. The cleanup was a cold, professional blur. We didn't talk. We didn't have to. We were on the job again, the old muscle memory taking over. We wiped the walls, secured the roomette, and locked the door. To any porter passing by, Frank was simply a passenger who had requested absolute privacy while he slept off a rough spell. It was eerie how easily the train settled back into its rhythm. Outside, the landscape was a blur of ink and starlight. Inside, the world was still sipping drinks, still laughing, still oblivious. "Rose," I said, my voice barely a whisper against the hum of the wheels. "You and Sarge stay in the lounge. Keep the drinks flowing. If anyone approaches, stay casual. We need to act like we're just passengers on a long haul." "And you?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "Johnny and I are going to check the forward cars. Paulie and Joe, you take the observation end. If you see him, don't play hero. You signal the rest of us. We do this quietly." As I stepped back into the corridor, the train felt different. The chief, once a symbol of luxury, now felt like a jagged piece of steel cutting through the dark, a fucking snake cutting through the heart of America. Every time I rounded a corner, my hand was on the grip of my piece, hidden beneath my jacket. Every laugh from a nearby compartment made my skin crawl. Somewhere in these rows of mahogany and velvet, Carver was watching. He was moving, thinking, and likely planning his next move to force us into the open. Johnny and I moved methodically. We didn't want to look like we were hunting. We simply looked like two men searching for a dining car or a restroom. But I saw the way Johnny's eyes scanned every latch, every ceiling vent, every shadow. "He's not in the open, Jack," Johnny murmured beside me. "He's too smart for that. He needs a plan. And he's going to need help. You think he'll try to reach out?" "He already did," Johnny said, his voice dropping an octave. "He thinks he has me. He's looking for a way off this train, and he thinks he can trade on the fact that he saw me once, years ago. He's going to bet on me being just as dirty as he is." I stopped in the narrow vestibule between cars, the wind howling through the gap. "You're going to play along?" "I have to," Johnny said, his face a mask of cold, hard focus. "He's got nowhere else to run, and he's dangerous enough to burn this whole train down if he's cornered. I'll go to him. I'll make him think I'm in. I'll get him to tell me his play, and then we finish this. If he suspects anything, Johnny, he'll kill you before you can blink." "He won't suspect," Johnny said, turning to look down the dark length of the next car. "He's arrogant, Jack. He thinks everybody has a price. I'm just going to show him mine." I watched him walk away. It was a hell of a gamble, but we were out of options. To catch a monster, we were going to have to let one of our own get close enough to feel his breath. "Paulie, go get Veronica," I said, my voice tight. "Have her stay with Rose and Sarge. Keep them in the lounge car. Keep the door locked if you have to, and keep your heads down." I pulled my backup pistol from the small of my back and pressed it into Sarge's hand. She took it with a nod, her expression as steady as a stone wall. "I don't think he'll try anything overt, but if he crosses your path, don't hesitate," I said. "Blow him to hell." Rose looked at me, her brow furrowed. "What about bringing him in alive? That was the whole point, Jack." "That was Adam's job," I snapped, the bitterness of Frank's death rising in my throat. "We can chop him up and deliver him to Kansas City in a suitcase or two for all I care. I don't give a fuck if he lives or dies. I don't even care about the reward. I just want to make it to Dave's wedding without leaving a train full of corpses behind us." I looked at the others, making sure they understood. These passengers are sitting targets. If they start to panic, if they realize there's a killer loose, all hell will break loose. "Joe, when is the train scheduled to make its next stop?" Joe didn't even check his watch. He'd been tracking the time like a hawk. "In 20 minutes. "Perfect," I said. "I want everyone watching the exits. Don't crowd the platforms, just watch. Be standing there keeping an eye on everyone getting off. If you see him, you take him. Do not let that bastard off this train." The team moved. Paulie headed toward the sleeper cars, and Joe and Sarge fell into position. I stayed in the corridor for a heartbeat, listening. The train was still thundering forward, the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels sounding like a funeral march. I realized then that my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering rage that was threatening to override my training. Johnny was out there somewhere, likely already closing the distance. He was walking into the web, playing the part of the assassin, gambling his life on the hope that Carver's ego would make him sloppy. I checked my own piece, the weight of the steel familiar and grounding in my palm. I wasn't just a passenger anymore. I was the Reaper, and I was going to make sure that when the chief hit Kansas City, Silas Carver was going to make it there, dead or alive. I started down the aisle, my eyes scanning every shadowed corner, every crack in the heavy wood paneling. The game was over. Now it was just the hunt. The whistle shrieked, a lonely, high-pitched sound that cut through the humid night air of the Kansas plains. I stood on the platform, my eyes darting between every soul stepping off the coaches and every wide-eyed traveler climbing aboard. I saw a mother, her face etched with exhaustion, pulling a young boy into an embrace as they were met by a family, a simple, beautiful scene that felt like it belonged to a different life. A farm boy, clutching a suitcase that held everything he owned, climbed the steps with a nervous, hopeful grin headed for the big city. But Silas Carver, he was nowhere to be seen. The pit of my stomach, already sick from Frank's brutal murder, dropped another few inches. If he wanted out, this was his best shot. A bustling station, a crowd to vanish into, a world of shadows outside the tracks. The fact that he hadn't moved told me everything I needed to know. He didn't want to leave. Not yet. He wanted the hunt. He wanted to feel the panic set in. He wanted to see us sweating in the dark, watching every shadow jumping at every creak of the train's frame. The sick bastard wanted to see the fear in the eyes of the passengers. "All aboard!" the conductor called out, his voice echoing against the depot walls. I stepped back onto the train, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind me. As the chief began to pull away, the station lights receded into the distance, swallowed by the vast, uncaring darkness of the prairie. The train started to pick up speed, the vibration hummed through the soles of my shoes, steady and relentless. I stood in the vestibule, my hand hovering near my holster. We were a mile out of town now, the train barreling forward into the void. He's still here, I thought. He's waiting. I turned and began to walk back into the belly of the beast, checking each car. The luxury of the dining car was empty, the silverware gleaming under the dim nightlights like surgical tools. I moved through the narrow corridors, my pulse steady, my mind clearing. If he wanted to play a game of fear, he had picked the wrong people to terrorize. I checked the status of the doors, the locks, and the windows. Everything was sealed tight. We were officially in a steel cage. Now I just had to find him before he decided it was time to make his next move. The sound of a gunshot reverberated through the metal-walled corridor, a sharp warning shot that punched a hole into the ceiling. The air in the car thickened, the collective breath of the passengers hitching in their throats as the normalcy of their trip shattered. I pressed myself against the frame of the vestibule door, keeping my body in the shadows. Through the narrow glass, I saw the scene unfold. Silas Carver stood at the front of the carriage, his posture loose and mocking, waving Frank's service pistol like a conductor's baton. He looked manic, his clothes disheveled, but there was a terrifying clarity in his eyes. He wasn't just robbing a train, he was staging a performance. Then I saw Johnny. He was halfway down the aisle, moving with the cold, deliberate economy of a man who looked like he had done this a dozen times. He held a leather satchel open, navigating from seat to seat, plucking wallets and watches from hands that were shaking so hard they could barely surrender them. Johnny didn't look frantic or desperate. He looked like a professional carrying out a task, his expression unreadable, and his movements fluid. He looked over at Carver, giving him a short, steady nod that carried the weight of someone who knew exactly how this played out. "Keep it moving," Johnny said, his voice flat and perfectly controlled. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Carver let out a jagged, triumphant laugh, though his eyes never left Johnny. "That's it, Hill. You're a natural. See that, folks? Just do as you're told if you want to survive." I felt the blood pound in my ears. It was a razor-thin margin. If Carver caught a glimpse of my silhouette, or if one of the passengers bolted and spooked him, he'd turn that car into a slaughterhouse. He was clearly trying to force us to reveal ourselves, trying to lure us into a direct confrontation where he could hide behind a wall of innocent people. I slid my hand down to my holster, my grip firm, but my thumb stayed off the hammer. I couldn't shoot. Not with the target shifting constantly, and not with Johnny in the direct line of fire. Johnny reached the end of the aisle. He stood directly below Carver now, the satchel full of stolen loot. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes met mine through the glass. He didn't blink. He didn't look worried. He looked at me and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Wait." I stayed pressed to the wall, my heart a dull thud against my ribs. Carver was so busy reveling in his own villainy, so lost in the power of the gun and the fear in the room, that he didn't realize he wasn't the one in control anymore. He thought he had recruited a partner. He didn't know he was standing next to a coiled spring, a man more dangerous than he could ever hope to be. I braced myself, waiting for the moment Johnny decided the dance was over. Every second felt like an hour, the train rattling on through the night, carrying us toward a reckoning I knew was only moments away. Chapter 7. The car was silent, save for the rhythmic thrum-thrum of the rails and the heavy, ragged breathing of the man on the floor. Carver had turned away, his arrogance proving to be the opening Johnny needed. It was surgical. The butt of Johnny's pistol came down with the sound of cracking bone, and Carver collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. He was out before his face hit the carpet. Everything that followed was a blur of grim efficiency. We returned the watches and wallets. The passengers, still in shock, took their belongings with trembling hands, too terrified to even look us in the eye. I caught the porter's gaze and gave him a look that told him exactly what was needed. A call ahead to the Kansas City authorities. I hauled Carver up. He was deadweight, his jaw slack, his manic energy finally extinguished. I threw him over my shoulder and carried him back to the roomette, the walk through the train feeling like a procession toward a funeral. When I shoved him into the small space and slammed the door, the air inside was already thick with the metallic, cloying scent of death. I cuffed him. Not to the wall, not to the chair. I cuffed his wrist directly to the cold, stiff arm of Frank Adams. Carver's eyes fluttered open a few minutes later. He blinked, the confusion of the knockout giving way to a realization that seemed to hollow him out. He looked at the handcuffs, then at the gray, sightless face of the man he'd killed. "Just kill me, Morgan," Carver rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You know you want to." I leaned against the door frame, watching him struggle against the weight of his new companion. "Why should I let you off that easy? I don't deserve to be cuffed to a fucking corpse," he spat, his face twisting in genuine horror. "This is cruel." "I figured you might want to sit and admire your handiwork," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You sick bastard." The rage broke him. Carver lunged, a sudden, desperate animal movement, but the chain jerked taut. He didn't have the leverage. The dead weight of Frank Adams acted like an anchor, dragging him backward until he collapsed onto the cooling body. He scrambled, gasping, trying to push the corpse away, but he was trapped. "I'll kill you," Carver shrieked, his voice climbing into a jagged, broken register. "I'll kill you all, especially your pretty little wife, Morgan. I'll take a knife and kill her slowly. I'll rape her with that knife while you watch." The moment the words left his lips, the temperature in the room seemed to drop below freezing. I didn't reach for my gun. I didn't shout. I just stepped forward and closed the distance until I was looming over him. "You're going to spend the rest of the trip in this room, Silas," I said, my voice dangerously low. "With him. And every time you look at his face, every time you feel his skin going cold against yours, You're going to remember that you're not a predator anymore. You're just a piece of trash waiting for the garbage man. I turned, stepped out, and locked the door from the outside. Enjoy the conversation, I muttered, turning my back on the screams that were already starting to echo down the corridor. I had a wedding to get to. The hour leading into Kansas City felt like an eternity. The hum of the tracks had become a constant grating vibration against my nerves. But I forced myself to walk back to the roomette. I needed to know he hadn't found a way to break the cuffs. When I opened the door, the sight stopped me cold. Carver was hunched over, his face a sickening mask of dark, wet gore. He wasn't just struggling. He was tearing. He'd been gnawing at Frank's forearm, teeth bared like a cornered rat, trying to rip through skin and muscle to sever the connection. He froze when the light hit him, looking up at me with eyes that had completely detached from reality. "I'm gonna get you, Jack," he wheezed, his mouth dripping with blood that wasn't his own. "You and your whole fucking team, especially that asshole Hill." I didn't have time to respond. The doorframe groaned as a shadow fell across it. Johnny was standing there, his expression devoid of anything but cold, terminal amusement. "Is that so?" Johnny asked, his voice smooth and lethally calm. Carver thrashed against the handcuffs, the dead weight of Frank's arm dragging him down. "No prison can hold me. You hear me? I am God," he screeched, his voice cracking against the ceiling of the small compartment. Johnny let out a short, dry laugh, the kind that held no humor, only the finality of a closing coffin. He looked at Carver, not with anger, but with the pity one might show a rabid animal that had lost its mind. "If you're God," Johnny said, tilting his head with a wolfish grin, "I guess that makes me an atheist." Johnny stepped into the room, and I saw his hand drift toward the back of his waistband. The air in the roomette suddenly felt vacuum-sealed. Carver's shrieking stopped instantly, his eyes widening as he realized that, for all his talk of divinity, he was just a man trapped in a box with a guy who specialized in ending people. "Jack," Johnny said, without taking his eyes off the prisoner, "why don't you step out? I think the mess in here needs cleaning up before the police get a look at it." I looked at the handcuffs, then at the carnage Carver had made of Frank. I realized then that Johnny wasn't there to talk. He was there to make sure that whatever remained of Silas Carver wouldn't be leaving this train with a tongue capable of making threats against anyone else. I closed the door, leaving them to it. The Kansas City Union Terminal was a hive of activity, the vaulted ceiling echoing with the hiss of steam and the hurried footsteps of law enforcement. David Thorne stood at the head of the gauntlet, his coat buttoned sharp, looking every bit the man in charge, until he saw us. As I stepped off the iron stairs, he smiled, though it was strained, and he gave a slow, weary shake of his head. "I should have known. Wherever you go, trouble follows, Jack." I glanced back at Rose, who was stepping off the platform behind me, her composure as unshakable as ever. "Yes," I said, a faint smirk playing on my lips. "But I call her Rose." The mood shifted the moment the rest of my team emerged. As Joe, Sarge, Paulie, Veronica, and Johnny stepped into the light, the police surged forward. They didn't move toward us. They moved toward the roomette we'd just vacated. Moments later, Silas Carver was dragged out, his face a bruised, unrecognizable ruin. He was kicking and thrashing, his throat working in a frantic, spasming rhythm, but he couldn't make a sound. The wet, rhythmic clicking of his jaw was the only noise he could manage. David's eyes widened as he caught a glimpse of Carver's ruined mouth. He looked at me, then at Johnny, who was calmly dusting off his sleeves. "Do I want to know?" David asked, his voice low. We shared a look, a silent, heavy recognition of the last few hours. "Probably not," I said. "I don't get paid enough for this shit, Jack," David said with a grin. Paulie cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "What about that reward money?" "We'll have to head down to the station to process the paperwork. David replied, already signaling his men to get the prisoner into a squad car. I have a better idea, I said, catching the eyes of my team. Consider it a wedding present. Joe let out a breath he'd been holding since we arrived. That works for me. The rest of the team nodded in immediate agreement. It was the easiest decision we'd made in days. David looked at us, his professional mask slipping just enough to show his relief. Fair enough, but for now, you're all a walking disaster. I need to find you a hotel, get you cleaned up, especially you two. He gestured to Johnny and me, noting the grime and the faint, copper scent of blood we were still carrying. Once you've had a bath and some fresh clothes, we're all going to dinner. You're finally going to meet my fiancée. I looked at the terminal, then back at the train, then finally at my team. The hunt was over. The violence was behind us, contained in the back of a police cruiser. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't have to watch my back. Lead the way, David, I said. I think I'm ready to be on vacation again. The air in the restaurant was thick with the scent of hickory smoke and the easy golden warmth of a summer night. We had spent the last 2 hours tearing through plates of burnt ends and ribs, the kind of meal fit for a king. Joan was everything David needed. She had a sharp wit that didn't just stand up to the stories we were spinning, it cut right through them. When Sarge started recounting some of our more questionable maneuvers, Joan wasn't fazed. She leaned back, laughing, and started needling us with the kind of precision that made Rose and Veronica grin. She didn't just tolerate our history. She held her own against it. Looking at her, I felt a weight lift. David had found the right balance. Then the noise at our table died down as David stood up. He looked around the circle. Joe, Paulie, Johnny, and me. He wasn't the fresh-faced kid who'd walked into the war. He was a man who knew exactly what we'd been through and what it cost to stay whole. I have something I want to ask, he started, his voice steady, though I saw the slight tremor in his hands. I have thought long and hard about this. I cannot pick one of you to ask to be my best man. I want you all standing up there with me. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was filled with the kind of unspoken history that didn't need words. I looked at Johnny, still showing the faint, calm edge of the man who had just finished a job in a roomette, and then at Joe and Paulie, my family. I stood up, resting a hand on David's shoulder. Brother, I said, it would be an honor. One by one, the others stood, the chairs scraping against the floorboards. There were no grand speeches, just a quiet, solid confirmation. We'd spent years protecting each other in the dark, and now, for once, we were going to stand together in the light. As we all reached out to shake his hand, I caught Rose's eye from across the table. She gave me a small, knowing smile. I sat back down, picked up my beer, and toasted to the man who was finally building a life that didn't require a holster. It was a hell of a night to be alive, Chapter 8. The laughter from the restaurant died the moment David's sedan hit the curb outside the hotel. The city night was humid, the streetlights casting long, jagged shadows against the brick facades. As we helped the girls out, David's police radio, a bulky, crackling mess on the dashboard, suddenly spiked with a harsh, high-pitched static. A dispatcher's voice, sharp with panic, cut through the quiet. All units be advised. Suspect Silas Carver has breached the transport wagon. Multiple injuries reported at the processing center. Suspect is armed, dangerous, and moving on foot toward the warehouse district. We all went still. David didn't look at his watch. He looked at us. The exhaustion in his eyes had been replaced by a familiar, dark intensity. I shouldn't do this, David said, his voice dropping into the register of a man who'd seen too much of this bullshit to play by the book. It's a police matter, but do you boys want to go hunting? I caught Johnny's eye. He was already leaning forward, his posture shifting, that lethal, calm focus returning to his face. I looked at Joe and Paulie. The weariness was gone. Okay, Dave, I said, my voice tight. But understand that this is the bachelor party. We can go grab a beer after we get this bastard, he replied. David didn't hesitate. He put the car in gear and spun the wheel, tires screeching against the asphalt as we peeled away from the hotel, leaving the girls in the safety of the lobby. The radio crackled again, more urgent this time. Update on suspect Carver. He has engaged patrol units. One officer down, fatally wounded. Orders are clear. Suspect is to be neutralized. Shoot to kill. The car plunged into the dark heart of the city's industrial district. The neon lights faded, replaced by the deep, hollow blacks of the warehouse maze. I checked the magazine on my piece, the metal cold and reassuring under my thumb. Beside me, Johnny shifted in the seat, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. He looked at me, then at David, and finally at the dark, looming warehouses ahead. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face, a grin that promised a fucking bloodbath. That's the plan, Johnny said, his voice a low, steady promise. The city's industrial district was a labyrinth of rusted, corrugated iron and dead-end alleys, but Carver was leaving a trail. It wasn't hard to follow. He wasn't trying to be stealthy. He was making noise, luring us, taunting the shadows. We hit the old municipal slaughterhouse on the edge of the stockyards just after midnight. The place was a hulking, skeletal frame of concrete, shadow, smelling of stale iron and rot. The silence inside was absolute, heavy enough to press against your eardrums. David killed the engine, and the car rolled to a silent stop behind a row of shipping crates. We moved out in perfect sync. No shouting, no wasted movement. Years of muscle memory took over, spreading us out into a tactical arc that swallowed the main loading bay. "He knows we're here," Johnny whispered, his voice barely a vibration in the air. He was right. A high, discordant laugh echoed from the rafters, bouncing off the damp concrete walls. It was a sick, wet sound, the sound of a man who had completely unspooled. "Come on out, boys," Carver's voice shrieked, vibrating through the vast, empty space. "I've been waiting for the party to start. I hope you brought your knives. I said I would kill you all, and that's what I'm going to fucking do." David caught my eye and motioned toward the kill floor. A sprawling, blood-stained concrete arena filled with hanging hooks and massive industrial grinding machinery. I nodded, signaling Joe and Paulie to flank the rear loading docks. Johnny, as always, was a ghost, melting into the shadows toward the overhead catwalks. I took the center, my weapon drawn, my heart beating in a steady, rhythmic pulse. The air here was colder than the night outside, freezing my lungs. "It's over, Silas," I called out, my voice flat, echoing into the rafters. "You've got nowhere to run. The police are surrounding the block. You're fucking done." Another laugh, sharper this time. A shot cracked against a hanging steel hook near my ear, sending sparks showering down like a grim firework. Carver wasn't hiding. He was hunting. "I'm a god, Morgan!" he roared from the darkness of the catwalks above. "Gods don't get caught!" I didn't answer. I just moved. I stepped behind a massive steel chute, listening for the shift of his boots on the metal grating above. Johnny was moving too. I could see the slightest sway of a hanging chain where he'd just passed. The stage was set. Silas wanted a finale, and he'd come to the right place for it. I clicked the safety off, my finger resting firm on the trigger. "Let's give him a show," I whispered to the empty air. The silence that followed the gunfire was deafening, save for the wet thud of Silas Carver's body hitting the concrete floor. He hadn't stood a chance. As we all fired simultaneously, the sheer force of the rounds hitting him midair turned him into a ruin before he even touched the ground. He landed with a sickening, heavy impact, and a split second later, his skull buckled under the trauma. His head split open like a cracked melon, a dark, viscous mixture of blood and brain matter spilling out onto the blood-slicked concrete of the kill floor. A few quiet minutes passed. The heavy steel doors then burst open, and a flood of flashlights cut through the darkness. The local chief of police strode in, his boots splashing through the carnage. He stopped dead, his eyes wide as he surveyed the scene, the body of Silas Carver, shredded by holes, and the grisly, pulverized state of his skull. "Who the hell are you guys?" the chief barked, his voice bouncing off the high, hollow ceilings. David stepped forward, his badge glinting in the harsh beam of the chief's light. "These are my best men. They're in from Los Angeles for the wedding." The chief looked down at the shredded, leaking remains of Carver, then back at us, his face twisting with disbelief. "Thorne, I know the orders were shoot to kill, but this asshole is Swiss cheese. Is this how you handle things in California?" I stepped out of the shadows, my face a mask of iron-cold exhaustion. "If we need to." The chief took a step toward me, his hand hovering near his holster, his face purple with suppressed rage. "I could run you all in. This isn't fucking Los Angeles, and I don't give a fuck how you do things out there, but I won't. Thorne is one of the best detectives in the whole city. If he says it was justified, that's the official story." He gestured toward the exit with a sharp, dismissive jab. "Just don't kill anybody else until you are far from Missouri. Got it?" "Chief, it was justified," David said, his voice flat and final. "Now get the fuck out of here," the chief snapped, turning his back on us to begin the grim work of processing the site. "You have a wedding to get ready for. I'll see you there." We didn't argue. We didn't look back. We moved with the silent, fluid coordination that had become our signature, slipping out into the humid night air before the local press could arrive. The city felt different now, quiet, expectant. We didn't head back to the hotel. We found a place that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1930s. A dark little dive where the bartender didn't ask questions and the whiskey was cheap enough to burn away the taste of the slaughterhouse. We sat in a corner booth, the five of us, Joe, Paulie, Johnny, David, and me, the weight of the night finally beginning to settle. The glasses clinked. A dull, somber sound. "To the bachelor party," Johnny said, his eyes hard and bright, raising his glass. I clinked my glass against his, the metal of my ring hitting the rim. "To the wedding." We drank it down in one go. The hunt was over, the monster was gone, and for the first time since the war, all of us were together. A drink or two became many drinks. The taxi ride back was a blur of neon city lights and the low, steady hum of the wheels against the pavement. By the time we pulled up to the hotel, the gravity of the night was hitting us in waves. The adrenaline of the hunt had worn off, leaving behind a hollow, whiskey-soaked fatigue. I stumbled through the lobby and into our room, my legs feeling like lead. Rose was waiting by the door. The moment she saw me, the color drained from her face. She looked ready to collapse, her eyes searching me for wounds, for blood, for the evidence of a fight she knew we'd been involved in. When she realized I was just drunk, staggering, smelling of cheap dive bar whiskey in the city, the terror in her eyes snapped into a sharp, white-hot fury. "Don't you ever do that to me again, Jack Morgan," she snapped, her voice trembling with the release of all that held back fear. I leaned against the doorframe, trying to pull myself together, but the world was still tilting. "I'm sorry, Rose dear," I slurred, a clumsy, lopsided smile on my face. We went out for a celebratory drink after the fireworks." She didn't let up. "Fireworks? You expect me to believe that? Did anyone get hurt?" I let out a low, dark chuckle that turned into a cough. "None of us did. Silas Carver got hurt. Silas Carver got fucking dead." The room went deathly still. The humor I felt, the grim satisfaction of a job finished, didn't touch her. She didn't share the relief of the kill. She only saw the man she loved coming home covered in the residue of it. She didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She crossed the room in 2 strides, throwing her arms around me, burying her face against my chest as if she could anchor me to the earth. "You scared me, Jack," she whispered, her voice cracking. The weight of her words hit me harder than any bullet. The alcohol seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. I realized what she'd been sitting through, alone in this room, waiting to see if I was going to be brought home in a box. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her tight against me, breathing in the scent of her hair. I held her until my own shaking stopped, the reality of the night finally sinking in. "I'm sorry, my love," I murmured into the quiet of the room. "I'm so sorry." Chapter 9. The morning sun poured through the stained glass windows of the church, casting long kaleidoscopic shadows across the pews. It was a beautiful, solemn space, smelling of beeswax and incense, but the atmosphere on the altar was anything but holy. We stood in a jagged line, waiting for the rehearsal to begin. David was checking his watch, looking nervous as hell, when the side door opened and the women walked in. They were supposed to be watching the pacing of the processional, but they stopped dead in their tracks about halfway down the aisle. Rose, Sarge, Veronica, and Joan were staring at us. Their expressions went from confusion to utter horror. "Jack," Rose said, her voice echoing in the rafters. "What on earth are you all wearing?" I looked down at my suit. It was a charcoal number I'd picked up in a hurry, slightly stained from the many long nights and violent fights. It was my best suit. I looked at Johnny. He was wearing a navy pinstripe that had seen better days. Joe was in a tweed sport coat, and Polly, poor Polly, was squeezed into a black suit that looked like it had been tailored for a man half his size. His shoulders were hiked up to his ears, and the jacket buttons were fighting a losing battle against his chest. "It's a suit, Rose," I said, trying to sound reasonable. "It's a disaster," Joan said, stepping up to the altar and giving David a look that could kill. "David, you let them stand up with you looking like a pack of bums who just crawled out of a boxcar?" "They're my best men, Joan, not a fashion show," David defended, though he looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. "They're a crime scene," Veronica added, eyeing Johnny's wrinkled lapel. "They are always a crime scene. I should know. I clean up after these goons." Sarge added with a smile. The no was collective, absolute, and immediate. We didn't even get through the first walkthrough. Before the priest could finish his opening remarks, the women had us effectively under arrest, marching us out of the church and into the waiting cars. 20 minutes later, we were standing in the sterile, fluorescent-lit aisles of a local tuxedo rental shop. The air smelled of mothballs and stale rental polyester. "I feel like a goddamn penguin," Polly muttered, tugging at the stiff, starched collar of a rental shirt that felt like it was designed for a strangulation. Johnny stood in front of the three-way mirror, adjusting his bow tie with the same cold precision he'd used to check his sidearm the night before. He looked at me in the reflection, a wry, dangerous smirk on his face. "Could be worse, Jack. Could be a body bag." I adjusted my cummerbund, grimacing at the tightness of the cut. "It's a monkey suit, Johnny, pure and simple. At this point, I'm not sure the body bag would be so bad." But then, I looked over and saw David. He was standing near the counter, finally looking at ease, his face illuminated by a genuine, quiet joy. He wasn't looking at the tuxedos or the rental fees. He was thinking about the walk down the aisle tomorrow morning. I smoothed out the lapels of my jacket and gave a short nod to the guys. "Ease up, fellas," I said, catching Polly's eye. "It's for Dave. If he wants us to look like penguins, we're the best-looking goddamn penguins in Missouri." "Hell," Joe laughed, finally relaxing his shoulders. "I guess it beats wearing bloodstains to a wedding." "We're not to the wedding yet, Russo." I joked. "There's still time." David heard what I said and gave a chuckle. We marched back out to the cars, a row of identical, stiff-backed men. It wasn't the uniform we were used to, and it definitely wasn't comfortable. The last time we all stood together in uniform, the world around us was being blown to hell. The second time around, the rehearsal went smooth. We were finally stripped of our mismatched rags and tucked into our matching tuxedos. We moved with a crisp, rehearsed efficiency that felt surprisingly natural. It was ironic. We could clear a room of hostiles without speaking a word, but the simple act of standing in a row at an altar had us feeling like recruits in boot camp. When David turned to me, his hands were steady, but I could see the hum of adrenaline in his eyes. He reached into his vest pocket and pressed the gold band into my palm. It felt heavy, a different kind of weight than the steel I was used to holding. "It's awful nice, Dave," I said, unable to resist. "But you're not my type." "Just hold on to it, smartass," Dave shot back, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. A ripple of low, stifled snickers broke out along the line. Johnny, Joe, and Paulie looked like they were trying to keep their faces straight. But there was a warmth in the air that had nothing to do with the summer heat outside. Then the gravity of it hit me. I stood there, turning the ring over in my fingers, and the old familiar uncertainty surfaced. I knew how to run an extraction. I knew how to secure a perimeter. But I didn't know the first thing about being a best man. I leaned in closer to David, keeping my voice low so the priest wouldn't catch wind of the tactical query. "Hey, Dave," I murmured. "Since the whole unit is standing up here, how does this work? Am I supposed to give a speech, or do we all give a speech? Because if it's the latter, we're going to need to clear the room, and I'm not sure the church allows that kind of language." David just laughed, shaking his head. "You're overthinking it, Jack. That's the beauty of it. We're all in this together. No speeches unless you've got something you actually want to say. And knowing you guys, keep it brief and keep it legal." I looked at the ring, then at the altar, and finally at the boys. We'd survived a train ride through hell and the slaughterhouse in the city. Maybe a few words at a reception wouldn't be the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was definitely going to be the most nerve-wracking. "Got it," I said, tucking the ring safely into my pocket. Short, legal, and, for everyone's sake, civilized. We stepped out of the cool, dim sanctuary into the bright Kansas City afternoon, the midday heat hitting us like a wall. A few of the guys had stashed a cooler in the trunk of David's car, and within seconds, we were all cracking open cold beers, the condensation slick against our palms. Johnny leaned against the stone steps. His eyes narrowed as he watched David. "You nervous, Dave?" David took a long pull of his beer, looking out toward the busy city street. "No," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I thought I would be. My gut told me I'd be shaking like a leaf. But Joan, she's great. The idea of spending my life with her, it just feels natural, like coming home." "Just wait," Paulie said with a knowing, cynical smirk. "I don't want to hear a fucking thing from you, Paulie," I said, pointing the neck of my bottle at him. "You and Veronica were like rabbits the whole trip. I'm amazed you had the energy to show up for the rehearsal." David looked over at Paulie, his eyebrows arched high. "Rabbits? Is that so?" Paulie didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. He just flashed a wide, shit-eating grin, taking a relaxed swig of his beer. "Call me Bugs, I guess." Johnny let out a short, dry laugh, and the rest of us joined in. It was a beautiful, easy moment of levity. I leaned back against the stone pillar, the tension of the last few days finally bleeding out of my shoulders. The church stood behind us, silent and imposing. But out here, the air felt lighter. "Enjoy it while you can," I muttered, taking a sip of my beer. "Tomorrow, you're a married man, and you'll be trading that bachelor spirit for a honey-do list and Sunday morning chores." David just smiled, looking back toward the church doors. "I'll take the chores. Hell, I'll take the whole list. Anything's better than the life we were living before all this." He was right. As the sun beat down on us, I looked at the group, Johnny, Joe, Paulie, and David, and realized this was the first time in years we were all together for a reason that wasn't surrounded by death. The sun dipped below the Kansas City skyline, and the city's neon heartbeat began to thump in earnest. We stood on the sidewalk as the women departed, their evening plans sounding considerably more civilized than ours. Joan stopped right in front of us, her gaze sweeping across the lineup of men who had just spent last night hunting a killer through an industrial slaughterhouse. "If Dave comes back drunk, bloody, dirty, or tattooed," she said, her voice cool and measured, "I'll kill you all." I didn't doubt her for a second. There was a look in her eye that suggested she'd already calculated the trajectory for all of us. As she ushered Rose, Sarge, and Veronica toward a waiting taxi, I felt a strange sense of respect. David had definitely found his match. "Well," I said, once they were out of earshot, "she's a keeper." We didn't go overboard. We kept it to a couple of drinks, letting the nerves of the upcoming wedding settle into a comfortable buzz. We steered David toward a local burlesque house, a place draped in red velvet and thick with cigar smoke. The music was brassy and loud, and the stage was bathed in spotlights. I leaned over, nudging David in the ribs. "See what you're missing out on, Dave? Last chance to look at the menu." David just laughed, shaking his head. "You're a married man as well, Jack. It's all just background noise to me now." Johnny didn't seem to hear us. He was perched on the edge of his seat, eyes locked on a dancer moving across the stage with hypnotic grace. His expression one of total, slack-jawed focus. "I'm not married," he muttered, almost to himself, his voice sounding a little too hungry. "I wonder what she's doing tonight." Polly, leaning back with a smirk, gestured toward the wings of the stage. "From the looks of that big ape at the side of the stage, Johnny, not going home with you." He wasn't exaggerating. Standing in the shadows was a bouncer who looked like he'd been carved out of a granite cliff. He made Dogface look like a lightweight. He was a mountain of a man, his arms thick as tree trunks, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's apathy. Johnny's gaze flickered to the bouncer, and the hunger on his face cooled into a professional assessment. He sat back, crossing his arms. "Fair point," Johnny conceded. "Maybe we just watch the show." After the set, we grabbed a late-night meal, greasy burgers, and black coffee that tasted like burnt rubber at a diner down the street. It was quiet, the five of us sitting in a booth, the adrenaline of the city finally beginning to ebb away. We dropped David off at his place shortly after. He needed the sleep. Tomorrow was the biggest day of his life, and he needed a clear head for the vows. As he walked toward his door, he turned back and gave us a small, tired salute. "See you in the morning, gentlemen," he said. "Get some sleep, Dave," I called back. We watched him go, then turned to head back to the hotel. It was a hell of a way to end the bachelor party. No blood, no broken glass, just a quiet night, a few laughs, and a groom who was actually ready to be a husband. Chapter 10. The morning light filtering through the stained glass was different than it had been during the rehearsal. It was sharper, more golden, marking the passage from the life we knew into something entirely new. The church was packed. It was a study in contrasts. The Sullivan side of the aisle was a dense, murmuring sea of Irish Catholic families, all rosary beads and Sunday best. Then there was the Thorn side. It was a quiet, disciplined block of people. David's kin, a handful of weathered detectives who looked like they were scanning the room for exits, and a sea of police officers. It was the most secure wedding in the city. We were all standing at rigid attention, backs straight, eyes forward. It was, without question, the most secure wedding in the history of the city. If anyone had tried to crash this ceremony, they wouldn't have made it past the vestibule. The organ music swelled, deep and resonant. Joan appeared at the back of the church, looking radiant on her father's arm. The old man walked with a slow, deliberate grace, but I caught the glint of moisture in his eyes. He was losing a daughter, but he was handing her off to a man who had earned his keep. When the priest reached the point of inquiry, "Who gives this woman?" the silence in the room was absolute. The father didn't shout, but his voice carried, thick with emotion. "I do." It was a simple admission, yet it felt like the final anchor being dropped. The service followed, the solemn cadence of the vows drifting over us. When the moment came for the rings, I reached into my pocket, feeling that heavy gold band. I passed it to David, and he slipped it onto Joan's finger with a steady hand. I stood there, watching the transition, and a profound sense of pride settled in my chest. We'd seen David through the worst of it, but this was the best of it. David Thorne and Joan Sullivan were officially joined. The pronouncement was made, and just like that, the world shifted. Joan was Mrs. Thorne. As the pews began to empty and the wedding party transitioned toward the dinner hall, the tension I'd been carrying, that instinctual need to watch the shadows, finally evaporated. Rose slipped her arm through mine, her touch grounding and warm. We walked together, leaving the sanctity of the altar behind us. She looked up at me, a soft, knowing smile on her face as she gestured toward the newlyweds. who were already surrounded by a laughing, boisterous crowd. "Aren't you glad we avoided all this?" she asked, her voice light and teasing. I looked at the chaos, the joy, and the utter domesticity of it all. I squeezed her hand against my side, content to be exactly where I was. "Without a doubt," I answered. The dinner hall was a blur of clinking crystal, soft laughter, and the hum of 100 conversations. The speeches had already been a mixed bag, some long-winded anecdotes from Joan's cousins, a few stiff-backed remarks from David's older relatives. When the microphone was finally passed to me, the room settled into an expectant hush. I didn't have a note in my pocket. I didn't have a rehearsed line. I just looked at the two of them. Joan, luminous and happy, and David looking like he'd rather take a bullet than be the center of this kind of attention. "Joan," I began, my voice steady, cutting through the ambient noise. "He may not look like much, but David Thorne is one of the bravest, most loyal, kind-hearted people I have ever met. I have no doubt he will make a great husband." I paused, letting the weight of it sink in. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw David's posture stiffen. He shot me a sharp, narrow-eyed look. The kind of look he used to give when he was waiting for the other shoe to drop, wondering if I was about to reveal some half-buried secret from the past. He looked genuinely worried about what was coming next. I let a small, knowing smile touch my lips before I continued. "Dave," I said, turning my gaze to him, "in the brief couple of days I have known Joan, I can see that she loves you very much, and she will keep you in line, which you need." The tension in David's shoulders broke, replaced by a sheepish, relieved grin. A ripple of laughter went through the room, light and genuine. "I speak for all of us when I say we wish you many years of blissful happiness together," I continued, feeling the sincerity of the words. "Dave, I love you, brother." I reached for the glass of champagne waiting on the table, the bubbles catching the light of the chandeliers. I held it up high, catching the eyes of Johnny, Joe, and Polly. They were all standing, their expressions solemn and respectful, a mirror of my own. "To David and Joan." The room rose in unison, a chorus of voices echoing the toast. I took a sip, the cold, crisp champagne a sharp contrast to the warmth in my chest. As I sat back down, David leaned over, giving my shoulder a firm, brotherly squeeze. The wedding reception reached that sweet, chaotic peak where the formalities dissolve into genuine joy. When the time came for the bouquet toss, the crowd surged, but Joan broke the script. She didn't turn her back. She locked eyes with Sarge and tossed the flowers directly into her surprised arms. I nudged Joe in the ribs with my elbow, watching his reaction. "Looks like you're next, partner," I teased. Joe didn't look annoyed. He just grinned, his eyes drifting towards Sarge, and I knew the idea had already taken root. It was a good look for him. Everything moved quickly after that. The rented tuxedos, those stiff, suffocating monkey suits, were dropped off, and before we knew it, David and Joan were off to start their new life. We headed back to the hotel to pack, the rhythm of our movements efficient but devoid of the tactical urgency that had defined the last few days. We had a train to catch, and for the first time in forever, it felt like a ticket to peace. The return trip was a different world. It was a vacation, despite Veronica's constant effervescent chatter. Of course, whenever she and Polly weren't engaged in conversation, they were busy trying to test the structural integrity of the train's sleeping berths. Maybe there was something about the rhythmic sway of the tracks that brought out the chaos in people. I lay in the dark of our compartment, pulling Rose tight against my chest. I listened to the steady clack-clack of the wheels and felt like the luckiest man breathing. I had a wonderful, resilient wife. I had a crew of loyal friends who weren't just colleagues, they were brothers. David's wedding was a success, and against all the odds, we had all walked away in one piece. When the train finally pulled into the station, the sight of the Los Angeles lights was like a cold drink of water. I was glad to be home. The apartment was exactly as we'd left it, but it felt warmer, more solid. The moment I walked through the door, Hammett was there, scrambling up my leg and onto my shoulder. He was a whirlwind of fur, meowing and purring, rubbing his face against my cheek as if he'd been abandoned for a decade. "I missed you too, boy," I whispered, scratching him behind the ears. I promise the next trip we take, you can go with us. He settled onto my lap, a heavy, vibrating weight of contentment. I leaned back in my chair, struck a match, and lit a Camel. The smoke curled toward the ceiling, blue and lazy. I reached over and clicked the radio on, letting the soft, familiar sounds of the city drift in to fill the room. The morning hummed with a quiet, mundane energy that felt like a luxury. The city was waking up, the sunlight cutting through the office blinds in dusty diagonal stripes. Hammett had claimed his spot on the corner of my desk, a warm, purring anchor against the morning pile of paperwork. Sarge was already at her station. Joe was across from her, nursing a lukewarm coffee and reading the sports section. It was the kind of unremarkable, beautiful quiet that only feels valuable after you've spent a week dodging gunfire. The door swung open a bit later than usual, letting in the clatter of the street and the heat of the sidewalk. Johnny and Paulie strolled in, moving with the lazy gait of men who didn't care about punching a clock. Paulie was in the middle of a long-winded rant, his voice echoing off the walls. "I'm telling you, she's got the whole house rearranged," Paulie complained, tossing his hat onto the rack. "She calls it spring cleaning, but I call it tactical displacement. I can't find my own damn socks, and she had the nerve to ask me if I liked the new curtains." "Maybe she's just trying to make you civilized, Paulie," Johnny shot back, leaning against the door frame and checking his reflection in the glass. I ignored them, my eyes fixed on the local news. The headline about a warehouse incident was buried deep in the back pages, a brief, sterile blurb about a botched police operation that had left the precinct relieved and embarrassed. Everything else was just the usual city noise. Traffic reports, local sports, and the slow, steady churn of a Tuesday in Los Angeles. I took a long drag of my cigarette. The smoke curling up toward the ceiling, the office felt solid, felt like ours. For a good 20 minutes, nobody did anything important. Sarge hummed a melody, tapping a pen against her notebook. Joe laughed at something in the paper. The mundane bickering between Johnny and Paulie faded into the background. It was that rare, fragile interval where the world wasn't asking us to save it, or chase it, or survive it. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a second, just listening to the heartbeat of the place. Then the handle turned. The door didn't just open, it swung wide with a confidence that made Sarge pause in her writing. She didn't look up with her usual, "How may I help you?" Instead, she looked up, blinked, and then a genuine, brilliant laugh bubbled up from her chest. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a soft scrape against the linoleum. I rounded the corner of my desk and stopped dead. There stood David and Joan. They were glowing, looking completely untouched by the city's grime, dressed in light, airy fabrics that stood out sharply against our cluttered, tobacco-stained office. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, the words coming out as a slow, disbelieving smile. David grinned, his hand resting lightly on Joan's back. "We never told you where we were going on our honeymoon. Surprise!" I didn't think twice. I stepped forward and pulled him into a solid, bracing hug, the kind you only give someone who's made it through the fire with you. I stepped back, looking him over. "This time, don't go to jail." Joan let out a bright, sharp laugh, her eyes wide with amusement. "Oh, I have to hear this story. Dave can tell you over breakfast," I said, reaching for my hat. "Let's go see Rose. If she hears you're back and you didn't swing by the diner first, she'll never forgive any of us." Rose was mid-pour, coffee pot hovering over a mug, when the bell above the diner door jingled. She didn't look up immediately, just another customer in the morning rush. But when David and Joan stepped into the light of the dining room, the pot stayed frozen in midair. The color drained from her face, then flooded back in a rosy flush. She didn't just walk out from behind the counter. She practically hurdled the end of it, her apron strings fluttering behind her like a cape. "David? Joan?" she gasped, her voice shrill with disbelief. She collided with them in a whirlwind of lace and wool, wrapping them both in a double-armed embrace that looked like it could squeeze the breath out of them. Joan laughed, a bright melodic sound that seemed to cut through the diner's habitual gloom, and David just stood there, beaming, looking like he'd won the lottery and was still waiting for the ticket to be verified. I stood back by the entrance, watching them, feeling a smug sense of satisfaction. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. "What about me?" I called out, feigning a hurt expression. Rose pulled back, wiping a speck of moisture from her eye. She looked over at me, her expression shifting from total shock to that playful, sharp-edged warmth I knew better than anything. She didn't stop her hustle. She just moved in my direction, planted a firm, grounding kiss on my cheek, and gave me a wicked, unmistakable wink. "Fine," she said, her voice dropping to a teasing whisper. "You can have one too, but don't think this excuses you from clearing those tables when you're done eating." She turned back to the others, already shouting an order toward the kitchen. "Shorty, put some extra bacon on. We've got company." I stood there for a second, the bell of the door still echoing in my ears. The diner was noisy. The smell of burnt coffee and sizzling grease was overwhelming, and the place was packed to the gills. But watching David pull a chair out for Joan while the guys squeezed into a booth nearby, I knew one thing for certain. We were finally truly back where we belonged. We were home.